The gavel slammed down, echoing through the packed courtroom as my father's voice cut through the silence like a blade. "Your Honor, she's completely useless. A disappointment to our family name." His finger pointed directly at me, trembling, with rage and humiliation. The crowd murmured, some nodding in agreement, others shifting uncomfortably in their seats. I sat there, 26 years old, feeling smaller than I ever had in my life. But what my father didn't know, what nobody in that courtroom knew, was that in exactly 43 minutes, everything would change. Because the woman he called useless was about to be addressed by a federal agent as Chief. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. The morning started like any other Tuesday in downtown Phoenix, Arizona. I adjusted my simple black blazer for the third time as I walked up the courthouse steps, my worn leather briefcase clutched tightly in my hand. The September heat was already oppressive at 9 a.m., but the chill running down my spine had nothing to do with the weather. My name is Jessica Chen Martinez, though most people just call me Jess. For the past 4 years, I'd been working as a junior paralegal at Henderson & Associates, a mid-sized law firm that specialized in corporate defense cases. It wasn't glamorous work, mostly filing motions, organizing discovery documents, and running coffee errands for the senior attorneys. But it paid the bills and kept me close to the legal world I'd always dreamed of joining. Today was different, though. Today, I was finally getting my chance to sit at the defense table during a major case. Not as an attorney. I dropped out of law school 3 years ago when the tuition became impossible to manage, but as the primary paralegal supporting our client, Marcus Holbrook, a local businessman accused of embezzling funds from his construction company. The irony wasn't lost on me that my own father, David Martinez, was the prosecution's star witness. I pushed through the heavy oak doors of courtroom 3B, immediately hit by the familiar smell of old wood polish and nervous sweat. The room was already filling up, journalists scribbling in notebooks, curious onlookers settling into the gallery seats, and court staff preparing for what promised to be a contentious day. My father was already there, sitting in the front row, behind the prosecution table. At 58, David Martinez still cut an imposing figure. His salt and pepper hair was perfectly styled, his charcoal suit pressed to perfection, and his expression carried that familiar look of stern disapproval that had followed me throughout my childhood. He owned Martinez Accounting Services, one of the most respected firms in Phoenix, and had built his reputation on being meticulous, honest, and utterly unforgiving of mistakes, especially mine. Our eyes met for a brief moment across the courtroom. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, a look I knew well. It was the same expression he'd worn when I told him I was dropping out of law school, the same one from when I'd chosen to work as a paralegal instead of joining his accounting firm, and the same one from countless family dinners where my younger brother Carlos's achievements in medical school dominated the conversation. I took my seat at the defense table next to our lead attorney, Patricia Williamson. She was a sharp woman in her 50s with silver hair pulled back in a severe bun and a reputation for dismantling prosecution cases with surgical precision. "You ready for this, Jess?" Patricia whispered as she arranged her files. "Your father's testimony is going to be the centerpiece of their case." I nodded, though my stomach was performing gymnastics. For months, I'd been working on this case, diving deep into financial records, tracking money transfers, and building what I believed was a solid defense for Marcus Holbrook. The prosecution claimed he'd stolen over $2 million from his company's accounts, using a complex web of shell companies and fraudulent invoices. My father, as Holbrook's former accountant, had discovered the irregularities and reported them to authorities. But I'd found something the prosecution missed. Something that changed everything. The bailiff called the court to order as Judge Margaret Foster entered. She was a no-nonsense woman in her 60s, known for running a tight courtroom and having little patience for theatrics. "Good morning," Judge Foster said, settling into her chair. "We're here for the trial of the state of Arizona versus Marcus Holbrook. I understand the prosecution is ready to call their first witness. District Attorney Robert Chen. No relation, despite sharing. Part of my hyphenated surname, stood up with practiced confidence. Your Honor, the state calls David Martinez to the stand." My father rose from his seat, his movements deliberate and confident. As he walked to the witness stand, I couldn't help but remember the man who used to help me with math homework at the kitchen table, patiently explaining complex problems until I understood them. That version of my father felt like a stranger now. After being sworn in, my father settled into the witness chair with the same authoritative presence he brought to client meetings. D.A. Chen began his questioning, establishing my father's credentials and his relationship with the defendant. "Mr. Martinez, how long were you Mr. Holbrook's accountant?" "Approximately 7 years," my father replied, his voice clear and professional. "I handled all aspects of his company's financial management. Payroll, taxes, quarterly reports, everything. And during that time, did you notice any irregularities in Mr. Holbrook's accounts?" My father's expression darkened. "Unfortunately, yes. In March of last year, I discovered a series of suspicious transactions. Money was being diverted from the main company account into what appeared to be shell companies. The amounts were substantial, sometimes $50,000 at a time." As DHN continued his questioning, my father painted a damning picture of systematic fraud. He described discovering false invoices, fake vendor accounts, and a pattern of deception that had been going on for nearly 2 years. His testimony was methodical, detailed, and devastating. But I knew something the prosecution didn't. During my investigation, I'd discovered that the shell companies weren't controlled by Marcus Holbrook at all. They belonged to someone else entirely. Someone who had been using Holbrook's company as a front for their own criminal enterprise. The real perpetrator had been careful, clever, and had successfully framed an innocent man. The only problem was proving it without revealing how I'd obtained the information. Patricia began her cross-examination, methodically questioning my father about his investigative methods and the timeline of his discoveries. She was building doubt, chipping away at the prosecution's narrative, but I could see it wasn't enough. The jury was buying my father's story, and why wouldn't they? He was a respected businessman with no apparent reason to lie. That's when everything went wrong. Patricia asked a seemingly routine question about the accounting software used by Holbrook's company, and my father's answer contained a small but crucial error. He mentioned accessing certain files on a date that I knew was impossible. The system had been down for maintenance that entire week. It was a tiny mistake, but it confirmed something I'd suspected for months. My father hadn't just discovered the fraud. He'd been involved in covering it up. I leaned forward to whisper this revelation to Patricia, but before I could say anything, my father's eyes found mine across the courtroom. Something in my expression must have given me away, because his face changed instantly. The professional mask slipped, revealing something cold and desperate underneath. "Your Honor," my father said suddenly, interrupting Patricia's next question. "I need to say something about this case." Judge Foster frowned. "Mr. Martinez, please wait for the question." But my father wasn't listening anymore. His attention was fixed entirely on me, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a bitter edge that made my blood run cold. "I've been watching my daughter throughout this trial," he said, his words cutting through the courtroom like shattered glass. "Sitting there at the defense table, pretending to be something she's not. But the truth is, Your Honor, she's completely useless." The courtroom fell silent. Patricia grabbed my arm, her eyes wide with shock. Even D.A. Chen looked stunned. My father continued, his voice rising with each word. "She couldn't finish law school because she wasn't smart enough. She can't hold down a real job because she lacks the discipline. And now she's sitting here playing lawyer When everyone knows she's nothing but a glorified secretary who couldn't find her way out of a paper bag. Judge Foster banged her gavel. Mr. Martinez, you will confine your testimony to the facts of this case. But my father was beyond caring about courtroom decorum now. He stood up in the witness box, pointing directly at me. She's a disappointment to our family name. A failure who's never accomplished anything meaningful in her entire life. The words hit me like physical blows. In that moment, surrounded by strangers in a public courtroom, my own father had stripped away every shred of dignity I possessed. The journalists were scribbling frantically. The gallery was buzzing with whispered conversations, and I could feel the eyes of everyone in the room boring into me. I wanted to disappear. I wanted to run from that courtroom and never look back. But something deeper than embarrassment kept me rooted to my chair. Because despite the humiliation, despite the public degradation, I knew something my father didn't. In exactly 37 minutes, his entire world was about to crumble, and the daughter he called useless was going to be the one bringing it down. Judge Foster's gavel came down like thunder, finally silencing my father's tirade. Mr. Martinez, you are in contempt of court. Bailiff, please escort the witness back to his seat and remind him that any further outbursts will result in removal from these proceedings. As the bailiff approached, my father seemed to realize what he'd done. The rage drained from his face, replaced by something that looked almost like panic. He returned to his seat without another word, but the damage was done. The entire courtroom had witnessed his explosive attack on his own daughter. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. Patricia leaned over to me, her voice barely a whisper. Jess, are you okay? We can request a recess if you need. I'm fine, I said, though my hands were trembling slightly. Let's finish this. But I wasn't fine. My father's words echoed in my head as Patricia continued her cross-examination. Every question she asked felt muted, distant, as if I were watching the proceedings from underwater. The professional composure I'd worked so hard to maintain was cracking, and I could feel the curious stares of everyone in the gallery burning into the back of my neck. What made it worse was that part of me believed he was right. Maybe I was useless. Maybe I was just a failed law student playing dress-up in a world where I didn't belong. The evidence folder in my briefcase, the one containing proof of what I'd discovered, suddenly felt impossibly heavy. After Patricia finished her cross-examination, D.A. Chen called his next witness, Detective Raymond Torres, the lead investigator on the case. Torres was a 20-year veteran of the Phoenix Police Department's Financial Crimes Unit, a stocky man with graying temples and the weary expression of someone who'd seen too many white-collar criminals. Detective Torres, D.A. Chen began, please, tell the court about your investigation into Mr. Holbrook's alleged crimes. Torres consulted his notes before speaking. We received the initial complaint from Mr. Martinez in April of last year. He provided us with financial records showing suspicious transfers totaling approximately $2.3 million over an 18-month period. Based on his evidence, we obtained warrants to examine Mr. Holbrook's business and personal accounts. And what did your investigation reveal? We found exactly what Mr. Martinez had reported. Multiple transfers to shell companies, fake invoices for services never rendered, and a clear pattern of systematic embezzlement. The evidence was overwhelming. As Torres testified, I found myself studying his mannerisms, looking for any tells that might indicate deception. During my 4 years as a paralegal, I'd learned to read people. Witnesses often revealed more through their body language than their words. But Torres seemed genuine, which made what I knew even more troubling. That's how. Detective wasn't lying. He'd conducted a thorough investigation based on the evidence my father provided. The problem was that the evidence itself had been carefully crafted to tell a false story. 3 months ago, while organizing discovery materials for this case, I'd stumbled across something that changed everything. Hidden in a box of routine. Financial documents was a USB drive that had been mislabeled as 2022 tax backup. Curious, I'd plugged it into my laptop, expecting to find boring spreadsheets. Instead, I found a gold mine. The drive contained the real financial records from Holbrook's company, records that showed the money had never gone to accounts controlled by Marcus Holbrook at all. Instead, the transfers went to companies owned by someone calling themselves DM Consulting Services. The initials alone had made my stomach drop, but it was the bank routing numbers that confirmed my worst fears. Every single fraudulent transaction had been authorized, using my father's digital signature. David Martinez hadn't just discovered the embezzlement. He was the embezzler. The realization had hit me like a freight train. My father, the man who'd built his reputation on honesty and integrity, had been stealing from his own client for years. When he realized the scheme was about to be discovered, he'd created false evidence pointing to Marcus Holbrook, and then, heroically, reported the crime to authorities. But why? My father's accounting business was successful. He lived comfortably, owned a nice house in Scottsdale, and had always seemed financially stable. What could drive him to risk everything? The answer came when I dug deeper into the USB files. Buried among the financial records were personal documents, medical bills, insurance correspondence, and loan applications. My father's wife, Elena, my stepmother of 12 years, had been battling cancer for the past 3 years. The treatments were experimental, not covered by insurance, and had cost nearly $2 million. My father had stolen the money to save her life. The discovery had left me in an impossible position. Exposing my father meant destroying not just him, but also Elena, who had no idea where the money for her treatments had come from. She was in remission now, healthy and happy, planning their upcoming 30th wedding anniversary. But staying silent meant watching an innocent man go to prison for crimes he didn't commit. For weeks, I'd wrestled with what to do. I'd consulted legal ethics guidelines, considered anonymous tips to the authorities, and even drafted a letter to the FBI. But every option seemed to lead to devastating consequences for someone I cared about. That's when I remembered something. From my incomplete legal education, sometimes the system finds a way to correct itself, even when individuals can't bring themselves to act. During Detective Torres's testimony, Patricia asked a question that made my pulse quicken. Detective Torres, during your investigation, did you examine the digital signatures on the fraudulent transactions? Yes. We verified that they matched Mr. Holbrook's authorized signature on file with the bank. And how exactly did you verify this? Torres looked slightly uncomfortable. Well, we compared them to samples provided by Mr. Martinez, who had signature cards on file as the company's accountant. I see. Did you independently verify these signatures with the bank's original records? Mr. Martinez assured us that his records were identical to the bank's. Given his cooperation and reputation, we saw no reason to doubt his word. Patricia nodded thoughtfully. So your entire signature verification was based on documents provided by the same man who reported the crime? Objection, DHN interrupted. The witness has already testified to the thoroughness of the investigation. Overruled, Judge Foster said. The witness may answer. Torres shifted in his seat. Mr. Martinez's reputation in the financial community is beyond reproach. We had no reason to question his documentation. As Patricia continued her questioning, I could see doubt beginning to creep into the jury's faces. She was doing exactly what I'd hoped, exposing the investigation's reliance on my father's credibility without revealing the smoking gun evidence I possessed. But it wouldn't be enough. Torres was a good detective who'd followed proper procedures based on the information he'd been given. The jury might have doubts, but doubt wasn't the same as reasonable doubt. That's when something unexpected happened. A commotion near the back of the courtroom caught everyone's attention. Two people in dark suits had entered quietly and were speaking in low voices with the bailiff. They looked official. Federal official. Judge Foster noticed them too. "Is there something that requires the court's attention?" One of the newcomers, a woman in her 40s with short auburn hair, approached the bench. "Your Honor, I'm Special Agent Sarah Mitchell with the FBI's Financial Crimes Task Force. We need to speak with you regarding this case." The courtroom erupted in whispers. DHN looked confused, Patricia appeared intrigued, and my father's face had gone completely white. Judge Foster called for a sidebar conference. As the attorneys huddled around her bench with Agent Mitchell, I caught fragments of their conversation. Ongoing federal investigation, jurisdiction, and new evidence. My heart was pounding. I had no idea what was happening, but the timing seemed impossibly coincidental. Unless Agent Mitchell returned to her partner, a tall man with kind eyes who had been scanning the courtroom. When his gaze fell on me, he smiled slightly and gave an almost imperceptible nod. That's when I realized this wasn't a coincidence at all. 3 months ago, when I'd discovered the USB drive, I hadn't just found evidence of my father's crimes. I'd also found something else: encrypted files that contained financial records from dozens of other businesses. My father hadn't been running a simple embezzlement scheme. He'd been part of something much larger, and someone had been watching. Judge Foster returned to her seat, looking grim. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I'm afraid we need to suspend these proceedings. This case has become part of a federal investigation that takes precedence over our state trial." The courtroom exploded into chaos. Journalists scrambled for their phones. Spectators began talking loudly, and DHN looked like he'd been hit by a truck. But my attention was focused on my father, who had gone from white to green and looked like he might be sick. Agent Mitchell stepped forward. "Ladies and gentlemen, I need everyone to remain calm and seated. This courtroom is now part of an active federal crime scene, and we'll need to interview several witnesses before anyone can leave." She began scanning the room, her eyes moving methodically from person to person. When her gaze reached the defense table, she paused. "Jessica Chen Martinez," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the silent courtroom. "Would you please come with me?" Every head in the courtroom turned toward me. My father's eyes were wide with shock and something that might have been fear. DHN looked baffled. Patricia squeezed my shoulder supportively. But as I stood to follow Agent Mitchell, I caught something in her expression that no one else seemed to notice. It wasn't the look of an agent preparing to question a witness. It was the look of an agent greeting a colleague. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but the biggest revelation was still to come. Agent Mitchell led me through a side door I'd never noticed before, down a narrow hallway lined with administrative offices. My legs felt unsteady, and my mind was racing with questions I wasn't sure I wanted answered. Behind us, I could hear the muffled chaos of the courtroom as bailiffs tried to maintain order. "Agent Mitchell," I began, but she held up a hand. "Not yet, Jess. Wait until we're secure." The casual use of my nickname sent a chill down my spine. This woman knew me, but I'd never seen her before in my life. Or had I? She opened the door to a small conference room typically used for attorney-client meetings. Inside, her partner was already waiting, along with 2 other agents I didn't recognize. A laptop was open on the table, and several manila folders were spread across the surface. "Please, sit down," Agent Mitchell said, her tone professional but not unkind. I remained standing. "I think there's been some mistake. I'm just a paralegal. I don't know why you need to speak with me." The tall agent with kind eyes stepped forward. "Agent Thomas Kelly, FBI Financial Crimes Division. And you're right, you are a paralegal. But that's not all you are, is it, Chief?" The word hit me like a physical blow. Chief. A title I'd worked 3 years to earn, a position I'd held in secret for 18 months, and an identity I'd never expected to hear spoken aloud in a Phoenix courtroom. Agent Mitchell opened one of the folders and pulled out a photograph. It showed me, but not as I appeared today. In the picture, I was wearing a dark FBI windbreaker, standing next to a confiscated server in what looked like a warehouse. My hair was shorter, pulled back in a ponytail, and I was pointing at something on a computer screen while two other agents listened intently. Operation Silent Ledger, Agent Kelly said. 18 months of undercover work, the largest financial fraud investigation in Arizona's history, and you were our lead analyst. The room seemed to spin around me. For so long, I'd compartmentalized my two lives so completely that hearing them mentioned together felt surreal. Jessica, the paralegal, and Chief Jessica Chen Martinez, FBI financial crime analyst, were supposed to be entirely separate people. How? I managed to ask. How did you know I was here? Agent Mitchell smiled grimly. We've been monitoring this case since it began. When we saw the name David Martinez as the key witness and noticed his daughter worked for the defense, we knew we had a problem. You're supposed to be on administrative leave, Jess. You're not supposed to be working any cases, especially not ones involving your own family. The truth was finally coming out, and I felt simultaneously relieved and terrified. For the past 4 years, I'd been living a carefully constructed double life. To my father, to Patricia, to everyone at Henderson & Associates, I was just Jessica the paralegal, a law school dropout who couldn't quite make it in the legal world. But 3 times a week, I drove to a nondescript FBI field office in Tempe, where I was chief financial analyst for the Bureau's Southwest Financial Crimes Task Force. It had started during my second year of law school. I'd been struggling with tuition payments and considering dropping out when Professor William Hayes, who taught my white-collar crime seminar, approached me with an unusual opportunity. The FBI was launching a new program designed to identify and recruit individuals with unique skill sets for financial investigation work. They needed someone young, someone who could blend into the civilian world while helping build cases against sophisticated criminal enterprises. The initial plan was supposed to last 6 months. I'd work part-time as an analyst while finishing law school, then transition into a full-time position after graduation. But as the program evolved, it became clear that my position as a paralegal provided perfect cover for long-term undercover work. I could access legal records, observe court proceedings, and monitor cases from the inside without arousing suspicion. Law firms trusted paralegals with sensitive information, but rarely saw them as threats. I was invisible in plain sight, exactly what the Bureau needed for Operation Silent Ledger, a massive investigation into a network of accountants, lawyers, and business owners who were using legitimate businesses to launder money for organized crime. The irony was devastating. While investigating financial crimes committed by corrupt accountants, I'd discovered that my own father was one of them. We know about the USB drive, Agent Kelly said, pulling out another folder. The one you found 3 months ago with your father's real records. We also know you've been struggling with whether to report what you discovered. I sank into a chair, the weight of the past few months finally overwhelming me. How long have you known about your father's involvement? We've suspected for about a year. David Martinez kept appearing on the periphery of our investigation. Clients whose books he'd handled, financial irregularities that seemed to trace back to his firm. But he was careful, and we could never prove anything concrete. Agent Mitchell sat across from me. When the Holbrook case surfaced, and your father was the one reporting the crime, we knew something was wrong. The timing was too convenient, the evidence too neat. But we needed someone on the inside to help us prove it. You used me, I said, though there was no anger in my voice, just exhaustion. We used the situation, Agent Kelly corrected. You were already working the defense side of a case involving your father. We couldn't have planned that if we'd tried. All we did was let events unfold while keeping a very close eye on things. He opened the laptop and turned it toward me. On the screen was a financial flow chart showing money moving between dozens of accounts across multiple states. At the center of it all was a company called DM Consulting Services. Your father wasn't just embezzling from Marcus Holbrook, Agent Mitchell explained. He was part of a much larger operation. DM Consulting was a front company used to launder money for a criminal organization based out of Las Vegas. They needed legitimate accountants to move money through real businesses, making it look like ordinary commercial transactions. The scope of it was staggering. According to the FBI's records, my father had helped launder over $15 million in the past 5 years. The Holbrook embezzlement was just one piece of a much larger puzzle. But why frame Marcus Holbrook specifically? I asked. Because Holbrook was getting suspicious, Agent Kelly said. He'd started asking questions about some of the transactions going through his accounts. Your father needed a fall guy, and Holbrook was the perfect candidate, successful enough to seem like a credible embezzler, but not connected enough to the criminal organization to expose the larger operation. As the agents explained the full scope of the investigation, I began to understand how deeply my two lives had become intertwined. Every case I'd worked on as a paralegal, every financial record I'd reviewed, every court proceeding I'd observed, it had all been feeding into the Bureau's understanding of this criminal network. There's something else, Agent Mitchell said, her tone becoming more serious. Elena's medical treatments weren't the real reason your father needed money. We've traced the payments to her doctors, and they total less than $400,000. The insurance covered most of it. My heart sank. Then why? Gambling debts. Your father owes $1.8 million to some very dangerous people in Las Vegas. The medical bills were a cover story, even to himself. He convinced himself he was stealing to save his wife's life. But the truth is, he was stealing to save his own. The revelation hit me like a sledgehammer. My father hadn't been a desperate man trying to save the woman he loved. He'd been a gambler who'd gotten in over his head and was willing to destroy innocent lives to save himself. What happens now? I asked. Agent Mitchell closed the laptop. Now we finish what we started. This case was always going to end with arrests, but we needed to build an airtight federal case. Your father's outburst in the courtroom actually helped us. It demonstrated consciousness of guilt and showed he was willing to attack his own daughter to protect his secret. The question is, Agent Kelly said, are you ready to come out of the shadows? Because in about 20 minutes, we're going back into that courtroom, and your real identity is going to become public knowledge. I thought about my father's words. She's useless, a disappointment to our family name. He'd been so convinced of my failure, so certain that I'd never amount to anything significant. He had no idea that his useless daughter had been building the case that would bring down his entire criminal operation. What will happen to Marcus Holbrook? I asked. All charges will be dropped immediately. He'll be completely exonerated, and he'll likely have grounds for a substantial lawsuit against the state for wrongful prosecution. And Elena? Agent Mitchell's expression softened. She'll be questioned as part of the investigation, but we have no evidence she knew about any of this. She's as much a victim as anyone. I stood up, finally feeling like I could breathe again. For 3 years, I'd been living a lie, pretending to be someone I wasn't, hiding my real achievements and capabilities. My father had called me a failure, but the truth was I'd been succeeding beyond his wildest imagination, just not in ways he could see or understand. I'm ready, I said. As we prepared to return to the courtroom, Agent Kelly handed me a new ID badge. Instead of my civilian clothes, I was given an FBI windbreaker identical to the one in the photograph. The transformation was symbolic but powerful. I was finally dropping the pretense and revealing who I really was. One more thing, Agent Mitchell said as we reached the door. When we walk back in there, I'm going to address you by your proper title. Are you prepared for how your father is going to react? I thought about the man who had raised me, who had taught me the importance of honesty and integrity, who had just publicly humiliated his own daughter to protect his criminal enterprise. The father I'd loved was already gone, replaced by someone I barely recognized. Chief Jessica Chen Martinez, I said, testing how the title sounded spoken aloud in this context. Yes, I think I'm ready for that. But as we walked back toward the courtroom, I realized that nothing could have prepared me for what was about to happen next. The courtroom doors swung open with dramatic timing. Agent Mitchell entered first, followed by Agent Kelly, then 2 additional federal agents I hadn't met. I came last, and the moment I stepped through those doors, I could feel the energy in the room shift completely. Gone was the simple black blazer and worn briefcase. Instead, I wore the dark blue FBI windbreaker, a federal badge clipped prominently to my belt, and carried myself with the confidence that came from 3 years of undercover work finally coming to an end. The transformation was so complete that several people in the gallery didn't immediately recognize me. My father did, though. His face went through a series of expressions in rapid succession: confusion, disbelief, and then something approaching horror as the implications began to sink in. Judge Foster had returned to her bench and was clearly struggling to maintain control of the unprecedented situation unfolding in her courtroom. The gallery was buzzing with whispered conversations as journalists tried to piece together what they were witnessing. "Ladies and gentlemen," Agent Mitchell announced, her voice carrying clearly throughout the room, "I need everyone to remain seated while we address some new developments in this case." DeChen stood up, looking thoroughly bewildered. "Your Honor, I object to this entire proceeding. The state has no idea what's happening here, and we haven't been briefed on any federal involvement in this case." "Mr. Chen," Judge Foster replied, "I'm afraid we're all learning about this together. Agent Mitchell, please explain what's going on." Agent Mitchell moved to the center of the courtroom, positioning herself where everyone could see and hear clearly. "Your Honor, members of the jury, officers of the court, what you've been witnessing today is the culmination of a 3-year federal investigation into a sophisticated money laundering operation." She gestured toward the prosecution table. "The case against Marcus Holbrook was built on fabricated evidence provided by David Martinez, who has been under federal surveillance for the past 18 months as part of Operation Silent Ledger." The courtroom erupted. Spectators began talking loudly. Journalists were frantically taking notes, and several jury members looked completely stunned. My father sat frozen in his seat, staring at me with an expression I'd never seen before. "Judge," Foster banged her gavel repeatedly. "Order! I will have order in this courtroom." When the noise finally died down, Agent Mitchell continued. "Mr. Martinez isn't just a witness in this case. He's the primary suspect in a federal investigation involving the laundering of over $15 million through legitimate businesses across 4 states. Patricia stood up, her legal mind already working through the implications. "Your Honor, if this is true, then every piece of evidence provided by Mr. Martinez is potentially tainted. The entire case against my client is built on fraudulent foundation." "That's correct," Agent Kelly said, stepping forward. "Marcus Holbrook is completely innocent of all charges. The real perpetrator has been Mr. Martinez himself, who created false evidence to frame his own client when that client began asking inconvenient questions." DeChen looked like he'd been hit by a truck. "Your Honor, the state was completely unaware of any federal investigation. We relied on Mr. Martinez's reputation and the evidence he provided in good faith." "We understand that, Mr. Chen," Agent T. Mitchell said. "This investigation required absolute secrecy to prevent the destruction of evidence and the flight of suspects. Unfortunately, that meant allowing this trial to proceed until we could gather sufficient evidence for federal charges." Judge Foster leaned forward. "Agent Mitchell, you mentioned this investigation has been ongoing for 3 years. How exactly have you been gathering evidence about activities that intersected with my courtroom?" This was the moment I'd been dreading, and anticipating in equal measure. Agent Mitchell turned toward me, and I could see a slight smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Your Honor, we've had an agent embedded in this case from the beginning. Someone who could observe the proceedings, access financial records, and monitor Mr. Martinez's activities without arousing suspicion. The silence in the courtroom was deafening. Every eye followed Agent Mitchell's gaze as it settled on me. "Chief Jessica Chen Martinez," she said, her voice clear and official. "Would you please step forward?" The title echoed through the courtroom, like a gunshot. Chief. Not a paralegal, not a failed law student, not the disappointing daughter my father had just publicly humiliated. Chief. I walked to the center of the courtroom, my footsteps echoing in the absolute silence. When I turned to face the gallery, I could see the shock on dozens of faces. Patricia's mouth was literally hanging open. D.A. Chen was gripping the edge of his table. Several jury members were leaning forward, trying to process what they were hearing. But it was my father's face that held my attention. The man who had called me useless less than an hour ago was staring at his daughter, really seeing her, for perhaps the first time in years. "Ladies and gentlemen," Agent Mitchell announced, "Chief Chen Martinez has been leading the Financial Analysis Division of Operation Silent Ledger for the past 18 months. Her undercover work as a paralegal provided crucial access to the EII legal and financial records that allowed us to map the entire criminal network." Judge Foster found her voice first. "Chief Chen Martinez, are you telling this court that you've been working undercover as a federal agent while employed by the defense in this case?" "Yes, Your Honor," I replied, my voice steady despite the surreal nature of the situation. Though, I should clarify that my involvement in this specific case was not planned. When I learned that my father was the key witness against our client, I immediately notified my supervisors at the Bureau. We realized this presented a unique opportunity to observe Mr. Martinez's behavior and gather additional evidence. Patricia finally managed to speak. Chief, are you saying you've been investigating your own father?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. This was the moment when my two worlds, personal and professional, collided completely. "No," I said carefully. "I've been investigating a criminal network. The fact that my father turned out to be part of that network was unexpected." It was a diplomatic answer, but not entirely honest. The truth was more complicated. I'd started noticing irregularities in my father's business practices months before I found the USB drive. Small things at first. Mentions of clients whose names appeared in other FBI cases, financial patterns that didn't quite make sense, payments that seemed unusually complex for a local accounting firm. But I'd been reluctant to pursue those suspicions, because he was my father. Even when the evidence became overwhelming, part of me had hoped I was wrong. Agent Kelly stepped forward with a thick folder. "Your Honor, we have warrants for the arrest of David Martinez on federal charges including money laundering, conspiracy to commit fraud, and racketeering. We also have evidence that will completely exonerate Mr. Holbrook." My father finally seemed to find his voice. He stood up slowly, his face ashen. "Jessica," he said, and for the first time in years his voice carried no anger or disappointment, just confusion and what might have been grief. "You're FBI?" I met his eyes across the courtroom. "For 3 years, Dad. I've been FBI for 3 years. But law school, you dropped out. I was recruited during my 2nd year. The Bureau needed someone young, someone who could work undercover in the civilian legal world. I didn't drop out because I failed, Dad. I dropped out because I was offered a position most people can only dream of." The silence stretched between us. I could see him trying to reconcile the daughter he thought he knew with the federal agent standing before him. The useless child he'd just humiliated was actually the lead investigator in the case that would destroy him. "All this time," he whispered. "You were watching me?" "All this time, I was doing my job," I replied. "I never wanted it to be you, Dad." I hoped until the very end that there was some other explanation. Agent Mitchell moved closer to my father. "David Martinez, You're under arrest for money laundering, conspiracy to commit fraud, and violation of the RICO Act. You have the right to remain silent." As she read him his rights, my father never took his eyes off me. There was no anger in his expression now, no disappointment, just a kind of devastating understanding. His daughter, the one he'd called a failure, had been succeeding beyond his comprehension while building the case that would send him to federal prison. The bailiffs moved in to escort him out, but he stopped in front of me. "Jessica," he said quietly, "are you really a chief?" I nodded. "Chief Financial Analyst, Southwest Division Financial Crimes Task Force." He closed his eyes for a moment. "I'm sorry," he said, and I wasn't sure if he was apologizing for the crimes, for calling me useless, or for the fact that his daughter had to be the one to bring him down. "I know," I replied. As they led him away, the courtroom remained in stunned silence. Judge Foster finally spoke. "Mr. Chen, I assume the state will be dropping all charges against Mr. Holbrook?" D.A. Chen nodded numbly. "Yes, Your Honor. All charges dismissed." Judge Foster turned to the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, this case is concluded. You are dismissed with the court's thanks for your service." As people began filing out of the courtroom, Patricia approached me. "Jess, Chief, I don't even know what to call you." "Jess is fine," I said. "At least when we're not in federal court." She shook her head in amazement. 3 years. You worked for me for 3 years, and I never suspected anything. That was the point. So what happens now? Do you go back to being a paralegal? I looked around the courtroom one final time. "No. My cover's blown now. I'll be transferring to a regular FBI position, probably in Washington, D.C. Operation Silent Ledger is essentially complete." As the last of the spectators left, Agent Mitchell joined us. "Outstanding work, Chief. The arrest warrants are being executed across 4 states as we speak. By tonight, we'll have taken down the entire network." I nodded, but I couldn't feel much satisfaction. Winning the case meant destroying my father, and no amount of professional success could make that feel like a victory. "There's one more thing," Agent Kelly said, approaching with yet another folder. "Marcus Holbrook wanted to thank you personally. He's outside if you'd like to meet him." As we walked toward the exit, I realized that my life was about to change completely. No more double identity, no more secret meetings, no more pretending to be someone I wasn't. For the first time in 3 years, I could be wholly myself. But that self would have to live with the knowledge that she'd destroyed her own father to serve justice. The useless daughter he'd humiliated in court was about to be promoted to the FBI's youngest division chief in history. Sometimes the truth is more devastating than any lie. 6 months later, I stood in the corner office on the 15th floor of the J. Edgar Hoover Building in Washington, D.C., watching the early morning sun cast long shadows across the Potomac River. The nameplate on my desk read, "Jessica Chen Martinez, Division Chief Financial Crimes Task Force." At 27, I was indeed the youngest person ever to hold this position. The view was spectacular, the responsibility immense, and the silence deafening. My personal phone buzzed with a text message from Elena. "Visiting David today. He asks, 'About you every time. Still won't see him?'" I set the phone aside without responding. Some wounds needed more time to heal. The Phoenix case had made national headlines for weeks. FBI agents' undercover investigation exposes father's crimes had been the most common variation. The media loved the dramatic irony of it. The disappointed father who unknowingly criticized the very daughter who would bring him down. But they'd missed the real story, the human cost of justice served at such a personal price. My father had pled guilty to all federal charges in exchange for a reduced sentence of 12 years. His cooperation had helped the FBI dismantle the entire Las Vegas money laundering network, resulting in 43 additional arrests across 6 states. The operation had been hailed as one of the most successful financial crime investigations in Bureau history. Marcus Holbrook had been completely exonerated and had received a formal apology from the state of Arizona. He'd also received a substantial settlement from his insurance company and had used part of the money to establish a foundation for wrongfully accused defendants. Last month, he'd sent me a handwritten note thanking me for having the courage to choose justice over family loyalty. I'd kept the note in my desk drawer, though I wasn't sure if what I'd done constituted courage or betrayal. A knock on my office door interrupted my thoughts. Agent Sarah Mitchell entered, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the slight smile. That usually meant she had news. "Good morning, Chief," she said, setting 1 cup on my desk. "I have an update on the Henderson case. Patricia Williamson had been thoroughly investigated but cleared of any wrongdoing. The FBI had determined that she'd been completely unaware of my true identity or my father's criminal activities. She'd resumed her practice and, according to Mitchell, had been telling people that her former paralegal was the most remarkable person she'd ever worked with. I wasn't sure how to feel about that either. There's something else," Mitchell continued. "We've received a request from the DEA for consultation on a case involving cryptocurrency money laundering. They specifically asked for you." I turned away from the window. What makes this case special? The suspects are using legitimate legal businesses as fronts, similar to the Phoenix operation. They need someone who understands both the financial crimes aspect and the legal world infiltration tactics. It was exactly the kind of case I'd built my career on, complex, challenging, and requiring the unique perspective I'd developed during my undercover years. But it would also mean going back to that world, albeit in an official capacity this time. "Send me the details," I said. After Mitchell left, I returned to my contemplation of the river. The past 6 months had been a whirlwind of congressional testimony, media interviews, and accelerated promotions. I'd been celebrated as a hero by the law enforcement community and featured on magazine covers as an example of dedication to justice. But late at night, in my Georgetown apartment, I sometimes wondered if I'd simply been a daughter who'd chosen her career over her family. My phone rang, interrupting my brooding. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but the area code was familiar. Phoenix. "Chief Chen Martinez," I answered. "Jess? It's Marcus Holbrook." I was surprised to hear from him directly. "Mr. Holbrook, how are you?" "Please, call me Marcus. I'm calling because I wanted to share some news with you personally. I'm getting married next month. To my attorney, actually, Patricia Williamson." That brought a genuine smile to my face. During the months following the trial, Patricia and Marcus had worked closely together on his civil lawsuit against the state. Apparently, their professional relationship had evolved into something more personal. That's wonderful news. Congratulations. "The thing is," Marcus continued, "Patricia and I were hoping you might consider attending the wedding. I know it's a lot to ask, given everything that happened, but you played such a crucial role in both of our lives. It wouldn't feel right to celebrate without you there." The invitation touched me more than I expected. These were people whose lives had been forever changed by the collision of my 2 worlds, yet they were offering friendship and inclusion rather than resentment. "I'd be honored to attend," I said. After ending the call, I found myself thinking about the strange trajectories that had brought us all to this point. Marcus Holbrook had nearly gone to prison for crimes he didn't commit, only to emerge with his name cleared and a new love in his life. Patricia had unwittingly employed an undercover federal agent, only to discover that this deception had prevented a terrible injustice. My father had built his reputation on honesty and integrity, only to destroy both in a desperate attempt to escape consequences of his own making. And I had spent 3 years living a lie, only to find that the truth was more powerful than any fiction I could have constructed. My computer chimed with an email marked "Urgent Eyes Only." The message was from Director Harrison himself. "Chief Chen Martinez, please report to Conference Room A immediately for briefing on Operation Golden Gateway." As I walked through the halls of the FBI headquarters, I reflected on how different my life had become. 6 months ago, I'd been Jessica the paralegal, invisible and underestimated. Today, I was Chief Chen Martinez, one of the Bureau's most prominent financial crime investigators. The transformation should have felt triumphant, but it was complicated by the personal cost. Conference Room A was filled with senior agents, federal prosecutors, and officials from the Treasury Department. Director Harrison stood at the head of a long table covered with financial charts and surveillance photographs. "Chief Chen Martinez," he said as I entered, "thank you for joining us. Ladies and gentlemen, meet the architect of Operation Silent Ledger and our new point person for Operation Golden Gateway." As he began outlining the new case, an international cryptocurrency laundering scheme involving Russian oligarchs and American tech companies, I found myself energized by the complexity of the challenge. This was work that mattered, investigations, that could prevent real harm and bring dangerous criminals to justice. But as the briefing continued, my phone vibrated with another message from Elena. David's appeal was denied. He wanted me to tell you he's proud of who you've become, even though he wishes he could have seen it sooner. I excused myself for a moment and stepped into the hallway. For the first time in months, I dialed the number for the Federal Correctional Facility in Phoenix. "This is Chief Jessica Chen Martinez with the FBI, I told the operator. "I'd like to schedule a visit with inmate David Martinez." It was time to face the man whose life I'd destroyed and whose words had inadvertently revealed the truth about mine. My father had called me useless in that courtroom, but he'd been wrong. I wasn't useless. I was the daughter who'd had the strength to choose justice over comfort, truth over family loyalty, and duty over personal relationships. Whether that made me a hero or something else entirely was a question I was still trying to answer. 3 weeks later, I sat across from my father in the visiting room of the federal prison. He looked older, grayer, but there was something in his eyes I hadn't seen in years. A kind of peace, or perhaps acceptance. "You came," he said simply. "I came." We sat in silence for several minutes before he spoke again. "I saw you on the news. Division Chief? Youngest in FBI history?" "Yes. I was wrong, Jessica, about everything. You were never useless. You were always the strongest person in our family, and I was too proud to see it." I nodded, not trusting my voice. "Can you forgive me?" he asked. "Not for the crimes. I know those are unforgivable, but for not seeing who you really were until it was too late." I looked at this man who had raised me, who had taught me right from wrong, who had lost his way so completely that his own daughter had to bring him back to justice. The father who had humiliated me in public was the same person who had encouraged my dreams in private. The criminal I'd helped convict was also the man who had instilled in me the sense of justice that made his conviction necessary. "I forgave you months ago, Dad," I said. "I'm still learning how to forgive myself." As I drove back to the airport that evening, I thought about the wedding invitation in my briefcase and the new case files waiting on my desk in Washington. My life had been forever changed by that moment in the Phoenix courtroom when my father called me useless. But his words had revealed more truth than either of us realized at the time. I wasn't useless. I was the daughter who'd had the courage to stand up when it mattered most, who'd chosen justice over comfort, and who'd proven that sometimes the people others underestimate are the ones capable of changing everything. The girl who couldn't finish law school had become the woman who finished what others couldn't start, and that was a truth worth more than any family approval I'd ever sought. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And, hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.